Hey Steph, have you
Hey.
set any boundaries recently?
Hmm. Yes,
Yeah. Oh, really?
but I don't want to talk about
Oh,
it.
damn it. This is a podcast. Okay. Could you talk about a
I
friend
mean,
of yours that might have set similar boundaries recently?
my friend has this podcast, and just kidding. It's not a podcast related boundary. Um, I have set them with myself in terms of my own expectations of myself and how to I want boundaries with those sometimes. There's like different parts of myself, right? That vie for different things. So sometimes I need to set boundaries with different parts of myself. Um, but also, I am always engaged in the nature of boundaries in my work life balance. That's something that is probably foremost. And it's been a big learning curve for me.
Can I pause you there? Because you
Yeah.
said something about setting boundaries with different parts of yourself, which I want to ask about because I'm not sure what you mean by
All
that.
right.
But can we define what boundaries are first?
Yeah.
Like
You
how
can
we're
do that.
talking about boundaries, how we're talking about boundaries in this
Mm-hmm.
episode. It doesn't have to be a
Yes.
perfect definition as such. I might think of, if we think of it like actually the word boundary, the boundary, the edge of something, right? So my boundary might be this is where I end and you begin, right? There's a boundary between us. On one side of it, there's you and there's me, and we're not the same person. There's a boundary of a whole ocean, in fact, between us. That's the
There is,
boundary
in fact. Yes.
between us. Now, what happens when people don't have boundaries and when their boundaries are really porous is it feels like an invasion. Like people can invade you because there's no protection there. And of course, boundaries, when they're too rigid, might become more like defenses. And there might be a case for those at times, for sure. But ideally, it's about self protection, being able to draw lines. I think saying no,
Yeah.
anytime we say no to something, is a boundary. It doesn't mean that a boundary always has to be this consistent thing. Like if I say to you, Steph, I never want you to call me stupid. That would be like a boundary, kind of, that I
Such
just
an
say from this
interesting one
moment
to
onwards,
pick.
just because she calls me that all the time,
Who
guys.
did?
She's really mean. Huh?
Who does?
You're really mean to me. Okay, so I say to you, Steph, stop calling me. I want you to never call me stupid again. That's my boundary. And you're
Yeah.
like, okay, right, all right, I'll try and accept that boundary. Compared to if you called me stupid and I just said, no, I'm not okay with that, that would be like a boundary in a moment. So I think we have boundaries that are more
Mm-hmm.
long term. And for a long term boundary, the other person has to be more cooperative. Or we have a boundary which is just in the moment, maybe standing up for ourselves, maybe saying no to something that is being pushed towards us.
Yeah.
That's not the most succinct, elegant, but how would you describe it?
Well, the way that I think boundaries are discussed most often is the no. And that was the first thing that I was thinking when you introduced the definition of what this is that to me, it's like in the shortest way of saying it, it's like the ability to say no to something. But I also need to, and maybe this episode itself could focus more on that, like the people pleasing, the porous boundary idea, because I think that could take up the entire time. But I don't want to neglect that some of us struggle with rigid boundaries and that is also an issue because and there's certainly times in my life and places in my life where my boundaries are too rigid. And that is also detrimental. And that is the restrictor. That's more of that restrictor pattern. But because this is such a complex topic, I think that when we're talking about boundaries and people pleasing and that tendency, it's more related, I think, to being able to say no to something, which is so super uncomfortable to a people pleaser because
Mm-hmm.
it won't please them. Like that's inherently juxtaposed to fawning, which is also part of the people pleasing tendency. But I did want to read this and then we can really go into the what I'm talking about because I'm about to cross my own boundaries right now by talking about this in two ways instead of just the one. But I did write this the other day and I thought it was um I liked it. Which is, hold on a second. If you resonate with being a food permitter, you may also associate boundaries with lack of access more than the right to advocate and protect. So for me, boundaries are about the right to advocate and protect. They're about the right to say no to keep yourself safe. I think that when somebody, not all the time, but sometimes when someone is struggling to have boundaries, it's usually two ways, right? So they might themselves have trouble saying no to others or to other things, but usually there's some reciprocal pattern where they also don't like having boundaries set for them because it reads to them as a lack of access, whether it's to some things, to food, to someone, or to something, right? And so boundaries themselves can be, instead of being seen as like a way that somebody is keeping themselves safe, it's seen as a way of keeping someone out. And that's, I think sometimes that, like, I think a restrictor is the one who's like, stop, don't come in, don't come in. And the permitter is someone who's perceiving themselves on the other side of that. That's like, I'm not allowed in, I'm not allowed in. And how that's, you know what I'm saying? So I am really aligned with the protection part because I am a, restrictor is in me. But when I'm working with clients, I'm noticing that sometimes that, like, you know how Brene Brown says boundaries are kindness? Like that is just like seen as the opposite of kindness. And like that's when someone's setting a boundary, they're thinking about it more as a rejection. And therefore, when they're trying to set a boundary or would like to set a boundary, it's seen more as, I don't want to reject somebody, or I don't want someone to, it's dangerous to do that.
Yeah, when you first said that, I was thinking, because of course I identify more with the permitter. I was like, no, I don't see it as about access. But you carried on talking, and I thought, no, I think that's just as I've got to know more and just understood so much more about this stuff, that there's enough here and now understanding to recognize that it's not about a lack of access, but a part of me feels like it is. So the people in my life who I have that are real introverts that need more time to themselves, I absolutely can feel that like a little twinge. And I'm like, Sarah, this is not personal. Like, this is just what they need. And I'll say that to myself and I can hear it because it's not a strong reaction, but I can definitely feel that more as a tendency. I can feel that tendency in me to, feel about it more being like a lack of access or a rejection. Or, I don't want you near me.
Right.
I can perceive it as this is about them, not me. But I would say 10 years ago, before I really even understood what these introverts were, these strange creatures that were introverts that don't want to be around people all the time. Who are these people? Before I really understood the introvert experience. That sounded weird. I didn't know. The needs of the introvert. I would just feel it as in somebody just didn't want to be around me and that it was personal.
So as the introvert, I have friends who are extroverts. And I have one friend in particular I'm thinking about who, that was exactly the dynamic we used to have, where she would be like, why are you rejecting me? And I'd be like, I'm not. I had enough.
But she's like, of me, you had enough of me.
What would happen is that I would feel guilty for that because, of course, introverts I thought there was something wrong with me. I also thought it was part of my like depression, which maybe it was a little bit, but also valid. And I would at times betray my needs to make her feel better. Like, so I knew she would feel upset if I didn't. And so I would give her more than I had capacity to give her. And then I would get resentful and I would end up maybe being a bit of a jerk, like I probably would I would be more impatient with her, or I would become, I think, a little passive aggressive later or over time about like really pushing her out to really create more of the space than I even needed, just as a way of making a statement. Over time, what that does is it confuses somebody because they're like, well, sometimes you're like in it with me and you're like doing it. And then all of a sudden you get like, you're being this other way. And this is the whole idea of boundaries or kindness, because what I wish that I'd been able to do is to say, I love you, but I need space and time to just have more clear boundaries about what my needs were. Because if I had been more consistent, if I had been able to hold my boundaries and name them, explain them, and hold them, that would have been less confusing to her. And that is not the only place where I've seen that come true. Like where a boundary isn't clear, it's confusing to somebody else. And then we on the side of the ones who should be holding the boundary we think we're being nice because we think we're like, oh, well, I'll just put my boundary down to make them happy. But then we're getting all mad about it. And of course we are, because when we cross our own boundaries enough, we will start becoming resentful. And that's where anger can come up. And we're projecting that anger on someone else. But really, it's like, that's our responsibility to hold the boundary. So that's what I learned a lot about in terms of like, it is kind to have boundaries because it's naming what exists and where and what you can expect. And then it's like, okay, now your emotions you're responsible for your emotions about that, but at least it's not inconsistent. So now, even though I still to this day find it uncomfortable to set them in some, you do it really well. And that's actually what inspired this episode, because we were having a chat before, in between recordings, and the story you were telling me was like, you have a good way of delivering boundaries that feels like it's very normal. It feels like, oh yeah, of course. But when I think about it, I get very uncomfortable to do it. But what I try to name is, this is actually the kinder thing. And I want to say, I had a lot of rigidity, and I spoke of that in my restrictor self. Like, there are places in my life where I have extremely rigid boundaries, and there are places in my life where I have really a lot of difficulty setting boundaries. So it doesn't have to be that you're just one or the other. It could be case dependent.
I was just, I think, surprised to hear you say that I'm so good at setting boundaries.
Really?
Yeah.
You're
But
like
then
my
I
boundary
have thought,
guru.
and then I have thought about a few. I'm like, maybe I'm better than I think.
You are. I feel like I've learned a lot about boundaries from you.
When you talked about boundaries not being clear, this is something I see a lot in my work with clients at the people pleasing end of the spectrum. They want to say no to something, and then they over explain, and so they get pushed back. So it would be like, let's say you with your friend, you said, oh, I can meet you for a couple of hours, but I slept terribly last night, so I need to come home and have a nap. And then your friend says, oh, that's okay. No, why don't you have a nap before you come? And then you can come and you can stay
Yeah.
straight through to the evening. Now, that could be experienced because it might be true that you needed a nap, but that wasn't the only reason. Nap aside, you would have still liked to have
Yeah,
just
you're like
had this
excusing it.
amount of time. But the other person, especially an extrovert who's just imagining you would just want all the time in the world together, the other person is there going, well, I'm just offering some solutions here about how
Huh.
you can have more fun with me. But it really feels to the person who's trying to say no that they're pushing back on me. Why are they pushing back on me?
Yes, it feels
This is the
disrespectful.
problem. It's the problem with over explaining, and
Yeah,
it's the problem with hooking everything on a reason
that's
or a
not accurate.
problem and it could be solved as well, because the other
Yeah,
person is going to try and solve it, and then you're like, but I told them I was only going to come
right.
for 2 hours. And I see that happens a lot.
Totally. And I
Mm.
think that comes from the discomfort with the boundary itself. If you say it's because I'm tired, oh, that's excuse. Then you're not setting a boundary. You're just tired. It's like, I think becoming more comfortable with saying no, like no is a complete sentence. It's within your right to say no to something just because you want to say no, not because you need an excuse for it. I think this excusing and justifying is the tendency of the people pleaser, to
Mhm.
be as palatable as possible. Even it's a taking up space thing too. Like, if I say no, I don't have it within me to do today, I think, well, number one, I think there's a self-judgment that comes up. Like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you want to? Why? You have low capacity. You can't get, there's a lot of judgment about our capacity. And number two, if I say no to something when I don't have an excuse, so to speak, for it, just because that's my preference, it's like taking up space. There's something in it that reads, I think, as like ballsy or like, you know what I mean? Kind of like, well, who? Oh, you don't want, like there's this need to excuse it somehow, and that's exactly what gets it into trouble, right? Because then I think there's something about owning it, owning your no, that can feel very threatening to people who have grown up potentially in an environment where no was either not allowed, not respected, or not practiced.
Yes. There's a difference between setting in a boundary for self-protection compared to setting a boundary in that's maybe more related to, I want to say, like a values thing. I shared on the podcast before, about when Becca wanted to come and see me for a weekend, and she was like, "Oh, I can let you know nearer the
Mm.
time." And I said, "Well, I need to know by this time because I can't hold that free." And as we were talking, I was thinking about this because I did exactly the same thing yesterday to a friend who was trying to rearrange a breakfast. And I said, I can do Friday. This was last night. Obviously, today's Thursday. But I need to know by tomorrow lunchtime. Because for me, I need to know if we're going to go for brunch on Friday. Because otherwise, I would like to make other plans. My time is my most precious resource to me. I really value, if we're looking at values, I really value my time, and I really value putting things into my time and my days off that I really like. That's not a self-protection thing. to say,
Mm.
I'll meet you on Friday, but you need to let me know by lunchtime
Yeah.
tomorrow. That's more about protecting a value. And that's where there is a risk of rigidity depending on how you use that. And there's also a risk of like a clash of values.
Yeah.
So someone like Becca doesn't like to plan too far in advance because that can feel quite confining and restricting for her, and that's her value.
Yeah.
And so we kind of have to have this little like negotiation around the middle where we each kind of respect the other person's value.
Yeah.
And having a more negotiable boundary is really hard when you struggle with boundaries because you don't
Yeah.
like where are you supposed to put yourself? What's reasonable? What's not reasonable? All of that is confusing, especially to a people pleaser who
Yeah.
I don't think I'm too high on the people pleasing spectrum. There's a little bit of that in there, but
Mm.
not a lot.
Well, this is putting you a bit on the spot, but I think sometimes what's hard about it is knowing how to deliver it. Because I think what sometimes can happen is that when we're putting up a boundary, it feels like conflict, it feels defensive. How do you communicate a boundary in a way that feels like, oh, like this is just my value? Oh, she's looking for it.
I'm going to try and find it. I got to think when it would have been because it was back at towards the end of.
It's interesting. It was on text. Of course it was,
It
because
was
that's what
on
we do.
WhatsApp. Yeah.
See, it's different in person. I was thinking about it. I think it's harder I could do it on text much easier than I could do it in person.
It would have been
Start to get
voice note. I
defensive.
don't think it'll be text. So this is in real time how I set this boundary where basically my friend wanted me to keep 2 weekends free. She was going to maybe come for one of the weekends, but let me know nearer the time. And I was like, I'm going to need to know sooner. I can't keep 2 weekends empty. I feel a bit because this was back in October
Okay.
the 27th. So I don't know. I
You
don't
don't
know
know what
how
you're going to
this is
say. You
gonna.
can always
I
cut
don't know
it.
what I'm going to say. Exactly, I can. So around those weekends, if you're not sure, could we leave it then until a time when you are like, yeah, I'm ready to book a weekend because I'm feeling like that's what I'm ready to do. Only because one of those weekends is only 2 weeks away, and then the other one's only 4 weeks away. And I'm somebody who likes to fill up her time. So for me to leave 2 weekends empty for a week, I just wouldn't want to do that if that's okay, because I like to make plans and have things in my diary because that is how I get my energy. So I'm going to leave it with you for when you're ready to go about planning a weekend. Maybe that's the new year or whatever, but I'm going to put the ball in your court on that one.
I think that is so helpful. I'm so glad we did this. You know what you did?
Yeah.
This is the most simple thing. You just said what was true.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. And you didn't
Yeah.
apologize. And I think why doesn't that occur to us? Because what it comes down to, whenever I am trying to set a boundary and when I understand that I need to, I have to stop and like remind myself that all I need to do is say what's true. But that is so hard. Sometimes maybe it's hard because I guess a different way of that exact same delivery, what you just said there, the risk that I think would come across someone's mind would be like, who am I? Because what you said was, I'm somebody who, like, I need to do it this other way because I'm somebody who likes to have my weekends booked because that's how I get my energy. And I think potentially that could feel to somebody like, who are you to like put that on somebody else? Or who are you to need to do it that way? As if you don't have a right. I think we assume sometimes that we don't have a right to do things the way we do them, or to like what we like, or to have the preference that we have. Again, social conditioning's got to be in there. Gender conditioning might be in there as well. But even just values of, oh, that value might not be theirs, and that's going to make me feel vulnerable for me to name what my value is if it's not theirs, because there can be sort of like a judgment opening then. But instead, what you did is you just decided to be like, this is how I run, this is how I work, this is how I like to do things. I'm going to own all of that and just let you know it. And I think that is what's so uncomfortable for some people. It's like, oh, you're just claiming who you are. You're claiming the right to your own needs and preferences. Novel, like that is not something I think we're trained to do.
No, and I think that's come a lot through. I don't know, because I'm trying to think about it. One of the books that really helped me was Martha Beck's Way of Integrity, because it really is about being very, very clear in what you say. Because there are times when, and I'll catch myself I try and stop it. I don't know, let's say there is something that I'm invited to and I don't want to do it. And there is another kind of reason that is true as well, but probably on its own wouldn't hold up. And I want to go, well, actually, no, because I might have to keep it free for this thing over here, even though that wouldn't necessarily stop me. It's so much clearer, even in myself. And it's one of those things I think that when you start practicing it, it feels really nice because it also means, and I've definitely had this before, and I think, if you're someone who struggles with boundaries and saying no because you feel annoyed or resentful that people are even asking stuff of you.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've got good boundaries, people can ask you whatever they want to ask you. That's absolutely fine. Because sometimes what people will say to me, things like, oh, and they asked me this, asked me that, can you believe it? And there's always a little voice in me that goes, well, they can ask and you can say no.
Right.
But I also know, like, I understand people have processes around this as well. It's not as black and white, or like, I'm not feeling as judgmental as that. But I understand that there's a block for that person in being able to say no. But if we were looking at something like, so that's not about self-protection, that boundary that I put in there. A self-protection boundary would have been, gosh, now my mum died in 2010, so that's 14 and a half years ago. And for the first couple of years, whenever I would go back to Bournemouth, I would stay at my parents' house with my dad. And there was just one occasion where he exploded at me because he thought I hadn't plugged something in properly. And it turned out I had, but he exploded. And I remember at the time, like, just shaking with rage, but also fear, And I'd honestly say it's the last time he's exploded at me was that time.
Hmm.
So this would have been 13, maybe even 14 years ago. I'm not sure. And I remember just getting into my car and leaving. I think I might have gone back to London. I can't remember. And from that day onwards, I made a decision that when I go down to Bournemouth, I do not stay there. I stay at a friend's house. I will go and see my dad. I will go out with him, but I won't stay there. Obviously, I live in Bournemouth now, so it's much easier. I can see him as and when. But for me to go and stay there just did not feel okay for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say that went in my own mind, but I didn't have to verbalize it.
Yeah.
Now, it might be different in someone else's family dynamic where someone might say, why aren't you staying at the house?
Mm-hmm.
But he never did. So
What would
that
you
for
have
me
done if he did?
I mean, I wouldn't have said, yes, I will. I think I would have just said, oh, I think it's more comfortable staying at friends or something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to practice this if you are somebody who isn't used to doing that.
Yes. And it helps as well to have people that you can practice it with. And by which I mean, there might be certain people in your life that would be much more open, much more perhaps emotionally intelligent to being able to receive a boundary. I know because Becca and I have talked about all kinds of things before that where we've had challenges that have come up around things one another has said or done. So I can trust with someone like Becca that I can say that and that will be okay.
Mm.
And then there are other people that perhaps it might. And then I'm thinking about it now, and I'm thinking, no, I would probably still do the same thing with my other friends, even if they didn't really understand a boundary. Because there's a little bit with me as well, because I'm so defensive of my time. Like I said, my time is really precious. For someone to say, could you keep these 2 weekends free for me for a week while I decide? There's just no part of me is willing to do that.
Mm. Yeah, I get that.
So what would my alternative be? To agree and then have to do it, or to say something? I don't even know that there's another alternative to that.
If she had said,
No, not if she had said. What was the thing? There didn't seem to be alternative. I either keep those 2 weekends open or I have to say something. I don't know that there's a third option.
oh, or I have to wish you said something and then it was okay.
Yeah. If I didn't
Yeah.
say something, well, then that's the only option, is to keep those weekends open. And it was something that, because it hits on something that's so important to me,
Yeah.
like my time.
Yeah. I'm thinking about situations like that would be one potentially, even though in this case it worked out because, Becca was able to receive what you said and not, but sometimes there's a clash of two different people in two different values that each side is protecting that do clash. I had a client message me recently to say she works with a trainer, longstanding relationship. They have a schedule every week, and she had a last minute trip that she scheduled. It was a personal trip and it was last minute. And so she canceled on her trainer at the last minute. And she came into WhatsApp and said, I explained that I wouldn't be able to meet, and he got upset and and I just kind of maintained that I had this trip and I needed to go, and I didn't feel like I needed to explain myself because I had a history of over explaining. Well, the trainer came back and said, well, I have a cancellation policy, and this violates my cancellation policy. So I'm gonna have to charge you for the session. And my client was like, can you believe it? I'm still holding my boundary. And it's like, okay, wait, he has a right to his. That is fair too. It doesn't mean you have to now concede and like not go on your trip or explain the situation. You can still say, okay, fair enough. You can keep your boundary and I will keep mine. And I think sometimes the boundary feels scary when the other person has a point or like has something else that might run in conflict, and it's kind of like there's gray area sometimes in negotiating two people's different boundaries. And some of it might be uncomfortable because they might have a boundary back. And that doesn't mean that you need to put yours down. There's not a winner. You know what I mean? It's kind of like we can manage the discomfort of somebody else having a boundary with us and still maintain our own. I mean, I'm thinking now about what that opens up in terms of like when I think about my mom and my dad and like my siblings and the family dynamics where it's like I've had boundaries and then my siblings in turn have these other ones and they're just a difference of needs. And I have to be comfortable with that. Like if I'm going to feel like I have a right to mine, I have to respect that they have a right to theirs as well. And that's where I think sometimes it can be uncomfortable because we're feeling like, well, if I'm setting a boundary, I shouldn't feel uncomfortable, or like I shouldn't have one coming back to me. So I think that this idea of becoming more comfortable with boundaries on two sides is important. Like we can't just work on setting them if we're not also working on receiving them and vice versa.
The cancellation policy is a really good one because that is, of course, something that as a therapist, I have the same thing. And I found it really hard in the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
So hard. It used to feel so wrong to take a client's money when I hadn't worked that hour. And I think I've only become more and more comfortable with it. I think since my time has become more precious, as in I just have a lot more on. I have a lot more to fit in.
Yeah.
That if I've held that space for you, because normally if I do have a week's notice, for example, because a client's going away or something, I can normally fill that slot because I have people wanting ad hoc sessions. Whereas if someone cancels at the last minute, that space doesn't get filled.
Right.
And having to sort of run a business.
Yes.
And rely on that. And I know some of my colleagues, it's often one of these debates in the Facebook groups for therapists, these threads around like when you enforce your cancellation policy and when you don't. Because quite a few therapists have it in theirs that if it's an emergency, then it's okay. And I'm thinking, yeah, but that to me is more vague. Just be black and white. I remember when I was in training, so, I'm forking out a lot of money for my training and for therapy and for supervision. I'm broke. And my therapist had a cancellation policy that you could only take time off and not pay if you were actually going away on holiday or something. So illness, no. I don't know if you wanted to go for a concert or an event or something like that. And I remember thinking, so if I needed a week off, I just said I was away.
Right.
And I wasn't truthful then.
Yeah.
This was a number of years ago.
It's tough. Yeah.
And because, I don't know, for me, I was just do it one way or another. I don't know why it annoyed me so much. So it's like, if you're actually out of area, fine. But let's say, I don't know, it's somebody's big birthday thing, at a very special occasion. I'm not talking about cancelling it just to go to the cinema or something like that. Then that doesn't count. And for me, it just didn't marry.
But what about when there is an emergency? Because I just had a client cancel this week because she had an emergency situation with her pregnancy, and of course, like I think there's context. But I think also then you open up to like things getting taken advantage of and then having to set that boundary, which I've had to do.
Yeah. But if you were going to a hairdresser's or the dentist or something like that, it doesn't matter if there's an emergency or something, you're still going to pay the money. Ultimately, these are people who are trying to run a business here.
And I get that now.
And so I'm okay with it because I'm okay on the receiving end of it as well. I think that's why I'm also more comfortable with it, because if it was the other way around and I don't know, let's say I had therapy and I got hit by a car and I broke my ankle, I would still pay for my therapy. It's not my therapist's fault. Why would my
Yeah.
therapist have to lose money because of this emergency situation? I appreciate I couldn't help it, but either way, I was expecting to pay that money anyway. I haven't lost the money. I've
Mm,
lost the session because the money in my mind was already going to be spent on that.
yeah. I don't know. I actually get around that issue because when I have programs, I build in 2 buffer sessions, which are essentially like you can reschedule up to 2 sessions per program. And however you end up rescheduling, those are fine. And I've come to just expect that that's part of the way I manage the expectation of how long a program will be. But you get the two. You get the two. I put up 3 fingers.
She's a smart lady, our Steph.
But when I have single sessions, I allow only one reschedule. And if you reschedule again, it's a cancel. And I came to that after because I remember I had a therapist once and I would not show up to therapy 50% of the time. Like I would just not show up. This is in college. And this therapist eventually had to call my mother, who was paying for everything, and been like, I have to charge for these sessions. She's not coming, like, and I remember being so upset about it. I was 19 and I was like, I'm struggling. How can a therapist not understand that I'm struggling? You know what I mean? I'm like, oh my God. Now I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe he let me get away with as much as he did because it was ridiculous. You know what I mean? And this is where it's like, I would have never put myself in his shoes because again, going back to the beginning, I think that when we have difficulty with boundaries, I think there is a one-sided experience. We're not thinking about what it feels like on that other side as far as that post I read. Like we're thinking about it as being excluded from something rather than understanding the way that those boundaries are serving someone's right to protect and right to advocate, right? And without understanding both, I think that's why it can be hard to respect boundaries. And I think back, about like the ways in which I felt like boundaries were some kind of affront to me all coincided with the time in my life when I had no boundaries of my own. You know what I mean? So the more I have gotten to know my own boundaries, the more I respect other people's. And that does feel more and more like kindness now. And interestingly, we did an episode on boundaries, food rules and food boundaries, episode 3 or 10, something very early. And when we talked about it, then I didn't like the word. I didn't like the concept of boundaries. And now I do. like now I'm like, oh yeah, like they need to be there. And because how much has changed for me even in 4 years, like around understanding their value and seeing them from that other side instead of the side of exclusion or rejection.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't even mentioned food. We haven't talked about food.
We've got
but it
2
obviously
episodes
plays a
on
role.
food bound.
Yeah.
We've got 2 episodes on food boundaries.
But it folds in. Like I find that if you're resonating with this conversation on a personal level, this will be playing into food as well, right? Like it's not going to be that different.
And there's a pattern even with, learning to say, the way I, talk about it from the permission perspective is practicing your no's is going nose. That sounded weird. Practicing your no or pluralized no. Before you have practiced guilt-free yeses is always likely to be kind of influenced by this restriction and may end up backfiring. But there is something about developing the capacity to say no for your own higher good.
Mm-hmm.
So that is in relationships, circumstances, life, and at times with food. But probably food may not be the first place to practice that when you're still dismantling restriction. If you start practicing it in other areas of your life first, that skill is going to be able to be transposed onto food as you're dismantling the restriction, but then able to sometimes say no to a food item that normally there would have been a very compulsive yes because you have to have it.
Right. Well, in the post about food permitters, sometimes I think the thought of saying no, thank you to food feels like you don't have access. It's like, oh, I'm missing out on something, or I don't have access to this delicious thing, rather than, and it's harder to think of because we were talking about boundaries in terms of one person and another person. But when we're talking about food and it's us and ourselves, it's like different parts of ourselves. And so there is a part of ourselves that might say, I want to have access to this thing, or I want to enjoy this thing, or I want to feel like it's mine, And there's another part of us that's like, that's not going to make me feel well, or I'm already full and I don't want to do that. And it's kind of like that part is the part that's saying like, I want to protect myself. And the other part is the part that's saying, but you won't let me in, and I think maybe a permitter might identify more with the side that's like, you don't let me in. And kind of like, what is it like to put yourself in the position of, and likewise in a relationship, the other person, the other side, the other part that is advocating for something, that's advocating for a need.
So back when, reversing back more when you're in your eating disorder and restrictor mentality, how would you have received a boundary then? Because you probably wouldn't have thought, oh, great, they're advocating for themselves. Did it ever feel like, though, you were being denied access to something? How would you have reacted?
Are you talking about with food or with people?
People.
Oh, well, so that was like the therapy time. Like I did not receive boundaries. I hated them. I did not.
But what did you think it was?
Exclusion.
So you didn't like it.
Exclusion.
Yeah. So what I mean is, I don't know that that's necessarily a permitter trait. Anybody who's going to struggle with boundaries surely is vulnerable to feeling excluded by a boundary from another.
I also don't think of myself as just a restrictor. Like I know that.
I know.
So, but the people who I know who are just restrictors don't seem to have this relationship of they don't feel that way. I'm not, of course some will, you know what I mean? There's no black and white, but I
with
find
other people. So, but are you saying then restrictors would just see other people and going like, great, they're advocating for themselves?
I don't think they would say it like that, but I don't think they would feel, I think there's maybe more of a guard up. I don't think it's the mentality of I'm being excluded. I think it's more like, I don't need it anyway. There's more of an avoidance, I think, there.
Okay. Interesting.
You can fight me.
I'm just not sure. I don't know about that. It doesn't ring, but then I'm not, I don't resonate with having a particularly restrictive mentality. But I can imagine some people I know who've been restricted are very sensitive to rejection. So they would feel rejected by other people's boundaries, deeply rejected.
Yeah, I think it just shows up differently. I think there's a difference too between, this is going to get in the weeds, but it's like there's a difference between what is conscious and what is unconscious. So my clients who are restrictors, like just restrictors, would hear a boundary and be would be like, totally get it, absolutely fine. And underneath that, in some subconscious layer, might feel shame about it or some kind of rejection. But consciously, they're like, no, totally get it. I will back up. Or, yep, there's a compliance there that has a different energy to it. Whereas my permitters, more of my just permitters, will kind of be more on the line of, oh, so rude. Like I'm so hurt, and it's what the conscious mind is doing with it is two different things. I don't know that it's that different from the subconscious layer, but it's like one takes an avoidant mentality and one takes a victim mentality.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is funny because like often the permitters tend to get like seen more as the avoiders.
I disagree. The permitters I work with, I don't see as avoiders. Emotional avoiders. Yeah.
Yes.
But not like avoidant attachment. They're more anxious attachment in my experience.
I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's what I see.
Oh, I do. I think it's probably fascinating how we see different cohorts.
And of course, our personal biases come into anything like what we notice as well anyway. So who knows what we're seeing. Life and reality is just a construct anyway. Why are we even doing this podcast? I don't know.
What's real? Nothing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, speaking of boundaries, time boundaries is another one. And we are coming up to time. Steph has to go in 5 minutes. And I respect your time, Stefanie.
Thank you. Now I'm stuck in a loop a little bit.
Oh, with what?
Well, now I'm like, well, no, I do have permitters who are avoidant.
Okay, it's okay. It's okay.
I'm like, wait, what about so-and-so? She's totally avoidant. She's a permit. Just needed to say it out loud.
Yeah, no problem. Get it out. Absolutely. Anyway.
All right. Well, let's go. We'll see you next week. We'll be back to talk about a different topic.
I'm sure we will.
We totally will. Okay.
Totally. See you. Bye.